Bodies dropped on cracked sidewalks and blood-stained corners that once felt safe to the kids riding bikes. Whole neighborhoods in Long Beach got carved into invisible lines, with each block carrying its own code and danger. Folks used to know the city for the port, the beach, and the sun, but the streets started telling another story altogether. The 20s, the Insanes, and the Longos built a reputation that traveled far beyond California. Their war flipped a beautiful city into one of the most feared battlegrounds in the West. To understand how it came to that, you gotta rewind before the bloodshed, back when the city's face was changing and tension started building slow but steady. Back in the 1960s, Long Beach was still seen as a blue-collar city, with military families stacking the neighborhoods. The port stayed busy, shipyards and Navy bases kept folks working, and the city felt like it had promise for those who moved there. The place attracted people looking for stability, but underneath that postcard look, the population was shifting in ways that set up the future conflicts. Mexican-American families started moving heavy into Long Beach in the 1960s and 1970s, many of them coming from East Los Angeles, where neighborhoods were already packed tight. These families brought culture, food, and strong roots, but they also carried the weight of being outsiders in a city that was still figuring out its identity. By the early 1970s, the Mexican-American youth in Long Beach organized themselves into a group that called themselves the Vario Longos, also known as VL13. They claimed the streets with pride, taking their name from the city itself, and tied themselves to the Mexican mafia, showing Sir 13 symbols on walls and tattoos. Over time, they split into East Side, West Side, and eventually North Side sets, locking down neighborhoods along Anaheim Street and enforcing their presence by checking outsiders and intimidating anyone they felt didn't belong. At the same time, African-American families were moving into Long Beach, many of them leaving South Central Los Angeles or Compton, looking for better housing and a chance to escape overcrowded neighborhoods. These families carried with them the growing Crip culture that had already spread across Los Angeles, but in Long Beach, the dynamics looked a little different. Instead of Bloods versus Crips being the main picture, like in Los Angeles, Long Beach saw independent Crip sets rising up, each tied more to their neighborhood than to the bigger umbrella. That independence planted seeds for both unity and conflict, because while they carried the same banner, their pride in their blocks made rivalries easy to spark. On top of that came a wave of Southeast Asian refugees after 1975, following the fall of Saigon and the chaos that swept Cambodia and Vietnam. By the mid-1980s, Long Beach held the largest Cambodian community outside Cambodia itself, and those families carried trauma from war and displacement. Parents worked long hours in factories or stores, leaving their kids to navigate the streets mostly on their own. Those Cambodian youths found themselves harassed by the Mexican gangs, especially the East Side Longos, who saw them as outsiders, taking up space in their territory. That tension pushed Cambodian teenagers to eventually form their own groups for protection. But in these early years, the atmosphere was just beginning to turn heavy. By the end of the 1970s, the city had become a layered mix of different communities, each one proud of its roots but suspicious of the others. Territorial pride grew sharper, and identity was often defined by what block you lived on or what group you stood with. Graffiti started spreading across alley walls. Old cars cruised blocks, blasting music that announced who controlled that street, and the police began to notice more kids organizing into crews. Survival in the city was no longer about just working a steady job or staying out of trouble. It was about who had your back when you walked down the wrong street and whether your name carried respect. The foundation of what would later explode into all-out war was already laid down in these years, with Long Beach quietly transforming into a city on the edge of something far more violent. The story of the Vario Longos starts back in the 1960s when Mexican-American families were settling heavy in Long Beach neighborhoods. Many of those families came from East Los Angeles and carried deep pride in their heritage, their culture, and their need to claim space where they lived. Out of those roots came a group of young men who named themselves after the city itself, calling their crew the Vario Longos, also written as VL13. That name alone showed they were serious about locking down Long Beach streets and putting respect on their own identity. The Vario Longos were not just some random crew playing around on corners. They connected themselves to the larger Sureño network across Southern California. The Sureños were under the wing of the Mexican mafia, also known as La Aime, which carried a powerful presence in the prison system. By taking on the number 13 and rocking Sir 13 symbols, the Longos showed clear allegiance to La Aime. That connection gave them a level of backing that other smaller neighborhood crews did not have, and it helped cement their place as a dominant force in Long Beach. In their early days, the Longos carved out strongholds across Anaheim Street and nearby blocks, and as their numbers grew, the set split into separate factions. The East Side Longos became the largest faction, with membership that reached several hundred active soldiers controlling wide stretches of central Long Beach. The West Side Longos controlled territory closer to the Los Angeles River, and they repped Oakland Raiders colors while enforcing their reputation through intimidation. Eventually, a North Side faction appeared too, adding another layer of reach for the Longos as they spread across the city. By the late 1970s, the East Side Longos were the largest group, and they earned a reputation that stretched beyond Long Beach. They repped black and white colors and made sure everyone knew who was in charge on their side of town. Law enforcement files from the time noted hundreds of active members, and those numbers only grew as younger generations joined up. For kids growing up in East Side neighborhoods, being part of VL13 became a way of life, because stepping outside the circle meant being an outsider in your own block. The culture that formed around the Longos came with a heavy sense of territorial pride mixed with aggressive hostility toward anyone they saw as outsiders. African American families moving into Long Beach during the 1960s and 1970s found themselves in direct conflict with the Longos, who did not welcome new neighbors on their turf. The Longos used intimidation, harassment, and straight violence to show that the blocks belonged to them. Young black teenagers walking through Anaheim corridors got confronted, pressed about where they were from, and sometimes attacked for no reason other than their skin and presence. The same hostility extended to Southeast Asian kids when Cambodian refugees began arriving after the fall of Saigon in 1975. Those Cambodian families had fled genocide and war, and now their children were facing a different kind of battlefield on Long Beach streets. East Side Longos saw them as easy targets, harassing them at schools, bus stops, and neighborhood parks. That pressure eventually forced Cambodian youths to form their own gangs like the Tiny Rascals gang. But in these early years, the Longos stood as the aggressors, making clear that nobody was safe walking through their claimed territory. The West Side Longos carried that same reputation, and detectives in later court cases testified about their aggressive tactics. Members of West Side Longos openly referred to black gangs as enemies, calling them crabs when speaking about Crips, which was a heavy insult in gang language. They wore their Raiders gear as a badge, and they let it be known that no one could disrespect their side without consequences. The idea of respect carried weight in the Longos culture, and failure to retaliate against disrespect was never an option. Graffiti started popping up all over Anaheim and surrounding blocks, with East Side Longos marking walls with ESL tags and Sir 13 symbols. These markings served as warnings for anyone passing through, letting them know the Longos had eyes everywhere. Outsiders crossing into their turf risked getting pressed, and the reputation for checking people became a trademark of their identity. Longos members would confront newcomers, demand to know where they were from, and punish them if their answer did not satisfy. This reputation for checking outsiders only fueled resentment from other communities and planted the seeds for defensive gang formations across the city. The rise of the Longos forced African American neighborhoods to organize themselves for protection. While many Crip sets in Los Angeles were formed for unity and identity, in Long Beach their rise was partly a reaction to constant harassment from groups like the Longos. Cambodian teenagers also started forming cliques out of survival, which would later evolve into full gangs that became enemies of the Longos. The Longos might have thought intimidation would keep them safe, but in reality, their dominance only stacked up more enemies, waiting to strike back. The Longos' ties to the Mexican mafia also played a role in how they carried themselves. La Aime demanded loyalty from all Sereno gangs, and the Longos followed those rules with discipline. Their allegiance to Sir 13 gave them a kind of authority when dealing with other Latino gangs in the area, because they had backing that carried from the streets into the prison yards. This power structure made them one of the most feared names in Long Beach, not only among rival gangs, but even among regular families who just lived in their neighborhoods. By the early 1980s, the Longos were fully established, running their neighborhoods with intimidation, violence, and a presence that stretched from the east side to the west side. Their dominance set the stage for the conflicts that would later define Long Beach history. The way they treated outsiders guaranteed that other groups would eventually push back, and the foundation for years of bloodshed was laid. The Longos built their empire on pride, violence, and fear, but in doing so they created enemies on every side, enemies who were already preparing for the wars to come. By the mid-1970s, Long Beach was beginning to feel the influence of the Crip movement that had started in Los Angeles. Young black families had moved south into the city from Compton and South Central, bringing with them a street culture that had already transformed neighborhoods back in Los Angeles. The Crips were not a single unit, but a collection of neighborhood sets, each representing their own block. and Long Beach would eventually become home to some of the most recognized sets in California. One of the first major Crip sets in Long Beach was the Rollin' Twenties, a crew that came together on the east side of the city. They claimed territory south of 21st Street, stretching toward downtown Long Beach, and they carried themselves with pride in their neighborhood. The Rollin' Twenties adopted colors from the Pittsburgh Steelers and New Orleans Saints, rocking black and gold as a way to show their unity. They also built themselves into smaller cliques tied to streets like 19th, 20th, and 21st, which allowed them to maintain a strong presence across different corners of the east side. The Rollin' Twenties became well known not only on the streets, but also through their connection to music. Calvin Broadus, better known later as Snoop Dogg, grew up in the Rollin' Twenties neighborhood and was tied to that culture. Even before he reached fame, the block had already made its name in Long Beach. But when Snoop blew up in the early 1990s, the 20s became known worldwide. Their identity, their slang, and their colors went from being a local signal to an international image carried on album covers and music videos. On the north side of 21st Street, another Crip set was forming, and that crew became known as the Insane Crips. Their base was around 21st Street and Lewis Avenue, and they built their reputation as the largest African-American gang in Long Beach. The Insanes broke into their own cliques as well, with the Big Insane Crips forming first, then the Young Foundation crew in the late 1970s, and the Baby Insane Crips coming later in the early 1990s. Each of those cliques helped expand the size and influence of the Insane name across the east side of Long Beach. The Insane Crips marked themselves with different gear and looks that helped identify them on the streets. The Baby Insanes wore Cleveland Indians hats and used symbols from the team to represent themselves. Other branches of the Insanes adopted their own codes of clothing, graffiti, and colors to make sure no one could mistake their presence. Their turf stretched across several blocks north of 21st Street, and they quickly grew into a force that no one in Long Beach could ignore. In the early years, the Rollin' Twenties and the Insanes were not enemies, they were allies. Together they called themselves the East Side Crips, standing as a united front against the pressure coming from the Vario Longos. Both groups were African American, and both found themselves being targeted by the Longos, so their bond was built on survival as much as identity. The East Side Crips alliance meant that the Longos now had to deal with organized resistance whenever they tried to flex power on black neighborhoods. This early alliance was important because it gave African American youth in Long Beach a structure for protection and unity. The Rollin' Twenties and Insanes backed each other up on the streets, handled business together, and made sure that any disrespect from the Longos got answered. This bond carried real weight during a time when the Longos were checking and harassing young black kids trying to live on the east side. For a period, the East Side Crips name carried enough strength to stand toe-to-toe with the growing Mexican sets. Street culture in Long Beach during this period became a way of life for many young people. Graffiti covered walls and alleys, announcing names like Rollin' Twenties and Insane Crips alongside the familiar Sir 13 tags from the Longos. Clothing became more than just fashion. It was a symbol of identity and a sign of allegiance. Rollin' Twenties repped Steelers and Saints gear, while Insanes marked themselves with Cleveland logos, and those small details meant everything when crossing into another block. Even sports hats carried heavy meaning in Long Beach during those years, because what you wore told everyone who you rode with. The reputation of the Rollin' Twenties grew even more in the 1980s as their influence in music became stronger. Young rappers from the neighborhood carried the stories of Long Beach life into their songs, and those songs traveled far beyond the city. Snoop Dogg, Nate Dogg, and Warren G all carried ties to Long Beach streets, and their music immortalized the culture of the Rollin' Twenties. This connection between gang identity and hip-hop made the 20s a household name even for people who had never stepped foot in Long Beach. Meanwhile, the Insane Crips kept expanding with new generations of youth adding to their numbers. The Baby Insanes especially built a reputation for being aggressive and fearless, and they gave the larger Insanes set a constant wave of younger soldiers ready to step up. Their organization into multiple cliques allowed them to cover large stretches of turf while maintaining strong ties across the group. By the late 1980s, their size made them one of the most recognized gangs not only in Long Beach, but across Southern California. As the East Side Crips alliance stood strong, the tension with the Longos kept rising. The Longos were not backing down, and their numbers continued to grow as Mexican-American families kept moving into the city. For a time, it looked like the East Side Crips would provide the answer to the Longos' aggression, but the unity between Rollin' Twenties and Insanes would later face challenges of its own. Before that fracture happened, though, both groups benefited from the strength of their early partnership. During these years, the seeds of future conflicts were being planted, but in the moment, the Rollin' Twenties and the Insanes stood side by side. Together, they gave African-American neighborhoods in Long Beach a presence, and a sense of pride. They built a culture that tied music, clothing, and street codes into one, and they made sure their names echoed far beyond the city limits. The expansion of the Crips into Long Beach during these years reshaped the city forever, and the foundation laid by the 20s and the Insanes would influence every conflict that came later. By the early 1980s, the tension between the Longos and the growing African American population in Long Beach had already turned into open clashes. Young black teenagers walking through East Side neighborhoods often got pressed by Longos members who made it clear they did not want them around. Those encounters did not always end with words, because many times fists and knives came out, and sometimes guns followed. The Longos carried themselves with the belief that Long Beach was theirs, and every black crew on the East Side was considered an outsider. African American youths from neighborhoods near 21st Street in Anaheim began responding, but the Longos had already built a reputation for deep numbers and heavy backing from the Mexican mafia. For the Crip sets like the Rollin' 20s and the Insanes, this meant every walk to school or trip to a corner store carried the possibility of violence. Being black in Long Beach at that time almost automatically placed you on the wrong side of Longo territory. That dynamic made the lines between racial identity and gang identity blur together, so that even neutral black kids often got caught in confrontations. At the same time, Southeast Asian families were flooding into Long Beach after escaping wars in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. By the mid-1980s, thousands of Cambodian refugees had built communities around the East Side, trying to rebuild life after years of trauma. Those kids were new to the city and new to American streets, and they quickly found themselves harassed by Longos in the same way African American kids had been. Many Cambodians went to schools in Long Beach Unified, where Mexican American crews already held power, and the harassment spilled into hallways, bathrooms, and playgrounds. By 1987, Cambodian youths began organizing for protection because getting jumped or chased became part of daily life. Out of that frustration came the Tiny Rascals Gang, or TRG, which started with a small group of Cambodian teenagers who decided they were tired of being targets. TRG grew fast, spreading across Long Beach and eventually Southern California, and they developed into the largest Asian gang in America. Around the same time, Vietnamese and other Asian youths formed their own sets like the Asian Boys, who also pushed back against Latino hostility in neighborhoods where they lived. The rise of TRG in Long Beach created a new warfront that nobody could ignore. Between 1989 and 1990, Longos and TRG clashed in dozens of violent incidents, including drive-by shootings that left bodies in the streets. In those 2 years alone, law enforcement linked multiple homicides and dozens of shootings directly to Longo versus TRG beef. Eastside Longos viewed TRG as an insult to their dominance, while TRG members saw every attack as proof they had to defend themselves harder. This cycle turned Long Beach schools and neighborhoods into battlegrounds where Cambodian kids armed themselves like veterans despite barely being teenagers. The black community watched this play out while still dealing with their own conflict with the Longos. For Crip sets like the Rollin' 20s and Insanes, the Longos' aggression never slowed down, and the gang treated all black groups as enemies, no matter what set they repped. Even kids who had no gang ties could get approached and beaten simply for being black in Longo territory. This created a dynamic where Crips found themselves pulled deeper into the conflict, not just out of gang pride, but out of necessity for survival. When one of their homies got jumped or killed, retaliation became mandatory, and that fueled a pattern of shootings that escalated throughout the late 1980s. The Longos' choice to treat all African American gangs as enemies hardened the walls between communities. Eastside Longos tagged walls with insults aimed directly at Crip sets, and in response, Crips tagged back with disrespectful markings aimed at Longos. Whole blocks became covered in graffiti wars that represented something much deeper than spray paint. Those walls stood as markers of racial division, and for residents living there, every tag carried the weight of a threat. Graffiti was no longer just letters on a wall, it was a sign that violence was coming to that corner soon. By the end of the 1980s, Long Beach had transformed into a city split across racial and gang lines. Latino crews like the Longos fought not just for territory, but for dominance over every other racial group. African American Crips were locked into a fight they never asked for but could not avoid. Cambodian kids who once tried to stay invisible were now rolling heavy with TRG, bringing automatic weapons into a war they had never imagined when they first came to America. Every group had their back against the wall, and nobody trusted anyone outside their own circle. These years planted the seeds for the bloodiest decade in Long Beach history because the foundation of the wars was built on racial identity as much as territory. The Longos' hostility toward Black and Asian communities guaranteed that alliances would shift and rivalries would deepen. Once the bullets started flying in the late 1980s, there was no way to walk the streets of Long Beach without feeling the heat of a war that was only just beginning. In the early years, the Rollin' 20s and the insane Crips had stood shoulder to shoulder against the Longos. But by the early 1980s, cracks started showing in their bond. The same unity that once gave them strength began to fade when territorial pride started outweighing old alliances. The line between their neighborhoods ran across 21st Street, and that line became more than a border. It turned into a wall that separated brothers who once shared the same fights. On the south side of 21st Street, the Rollin' 20s had their turf locked down, with blocks stretching toward downtown and carrying a growing name on the streets. On the north side of 21st Street, the insane stood strong, building size and reputation with every new generation stepping in. That single dividing line turned into the most important street in Long Beach because it marked the difference between a homie and an enemy. Crossing it without permission could spark instant trouble, even for someone who had once been an ally. The pride each set carried for their blocks made it hard for either side to back down when disputes came up. Fights broke out over territory, respect, and street incidents that might have seemed small to outsiders, but meant everything in their world. When a member from one side felt disrespected, the entire set carried that weight, and retaliation became a demand. That cycle turned arguments into fistfights, and fistfights into shootouts, with no real way to slow it down. By the mid-1980s, the alliance that once called itself the East Side Crips was gone, replaced by open warfare between the Rollin' 20s and the Insanes. Neighbors who had once fought together against Longos were now pointing guns at each other across the same streets. It was not just a rivalry between gangs, it became a fratricidal conflict that split families and neighborhoods down the middle. Brothers who grew up on the same block sometimes ended up claiming opposite sides, and friendships were destroyed when loyalty to the set came first. The year 1985 marked a dangerous peak in the feud between the two sets. Long Beach reported a surge in gang-related homicides that year, with many tied directly to Rollin' 20s and insane clashes. Police records and newspaper reports described a wave of killings that shocked the community and highlighted how far the feud had gone. The same groups that once defended each other against the Longos were now adding to the city's rising body count, and the violence showed no signs of slowing down. Graffiti wars broke out across Long Beach, marking every wall, alley, and abandoned building with insults from both sides. Rollin' 20s began writing "Insane Killer" across East Side walls, while Insanes responded with 20 killer tags in their own territories. These markings served as both warnings and declarations, telling anyone passing through which side controlled that space and how deep the hatred had grown. What once were neighborhoods tied together under the East Side Crips name had become battlegrounds where graffiti was the first shot in an ongoing war. The split between the two sets was not only about territory or pride, it was also about ego and identity. Both Rollin' 20s and Insanes wanted to be seen as the top dogs in Long Beach, and neither side was willing to accept a second-place role. That drive for dominance kept fueling the cycle of retaliation, because every killing or shooting demanded another one in response. For many young members, the feud became the only reality they knew, and peace felt impossible when the culture demanded payback. Stories spread of families caught in the middle, with cousins or even brothers repping opposite sides of the feud. Some households had one son rolling with the 20s, while another aligned with the Insanes, creating constant tension that spilled into daily life. Neighbors who once shared barbecues now crossed the street to avoid each other because loyalty to the set mattered more than childhood friendships. The sense of community that once bound the East Side began to dissolve, replaced by suspicion and the constant risk of violence. For the Rollin' 20s, the feud meant their growing reputation for music and street presence was shadowed by bloodshed with their former allies. For the Insanes, the conflict meant their numbers and organization were constantly tested by retaliations and the pressure to stand strong against rivals who once had their backs. Each side developed legends and stories of homies lost in the feud, and those stories became part of the culture that kept the conflict alive. The names of young men killed in the mid-1980s echoed through both sets, pushing younger members to keep the fight going. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the bond between the Rollin' 20s and the Insanes was broken beyond repair. The graffiti wars, the rising body counts, and the split across 21st Street had turned allies into sworn enemies. The East Side Crips name no longer stood for unity, because now it carried memories of betrayal and conflict. The rivalry between the two sets became one of the defining features of Long Beach gang history, shaping the violence that would continue into the next decades. The transformation from allies to enemies showed how fragile unity could be in a city where pride, territory and ego ruled everything. The Rolling 20s and the Insanes had once stood against the Longos as brothers, but by the mid-1980s, they were driving up the murder rate in Long Beach with their own war. Their story became a warning of how quickly alliances could collapse and how easily survival turned into destruction when lines got drawn in the streets. The war between the Rolling 20s and the Insanes was just beginning, and the city was already paying the price. By the mid-1980s, Long Beach had turned into a city locked in 3 different wars happening all at once. The Rolling 20s and the Insanes were no longer allies, and their feud kept stacking bodies on both sides of 21st Street. At the same time, both sets stayed locked in their battles with the Longos, who refused to give up ground in East Side neighborhoods. That meant Long Beach was facing a 3-way war: Rolling 20s against Insanes, Rolling 20s against Longos, and Insanes against Longos all at the same time. The city became a war zone where every corner carried the possibility of gunfire or retaliation. For regular families who lived in Long Beach, the streets felt unsafe even during the middle of the day. Mothers kept kids from playing outside, and neighbors stayed inside once the sun went down because drive-by shootings happened without warning. Even something as simple as crossing into the wrong block could mean running into trouble if you did not have the right backing. As the violence spread, the city of Long Beach earned a reputation that reached far beyond California. By 1990, reports counted around 70 active gangs in Long Beach, with over 11,000 members tied into the conflicts. Those numbers made Long Beach one of the heaviest gang-saturated cities in the country at that time. The East Side was especially packed, with different crews claiming blocks only a few streets apart, and that density kept tension high every single day. The 3-way war created a constant rotation of enemies, because no set could afford to let disrespect slide. If the Rolling 20s retaliated against the Insanes, the Longos might take advantage and hit them while they were distracted. If the Insanes made a move on the Longos, the Rolling 20s could use the chance to press their own advantage. This cycle meant that every shooting sparked another, and there was never enough time to heal before the next wave hit. By 1991, the numbers showed just how bloody the situation had become. That year, Long Beach recorded 104 murders, which stood as the highest number in the city's history. More than half of those killings were connected directly to gang activity, with Rolling 20s, Insanes, and Longos heavily involved in the count. Newspapers described Long Beach as one of the deadliest cities in California, and residents knew that their home was no longer seen as just a beachside community. Instead, it carried the image of a city torn apart by violence. Graffiti wars and street tags painted the picture of the conflict across the neighborhoods. 20 killer markings from Insanes appeared on walls. Insane killer tags from the 20s hit back, and Longos sprayed Sir 13 across alleys to show their claim. Those walls stood as billboards for the war, reminding everyone that peace was nowhere in sight. Even city officials admitted they could not keep up with the level of street violence happening in their neighborhoods. During these years, Long Beach became known by a name that stuck for decades: Crip City. The nickname came from the heavy presence of Crip sets, especially the Rolling 20s and the Insanes, who both held down major territory despite their feud. Outsiders recognized Long Beach as a place where Crip culture ran deep, but inside the city, residents understood that the name carried as much fear as pride. For many kids growing up in those neighborhoods, being from Long Beach meant carrying the weight of that reputation every time they left their block. The 3-way war reshaped the identity of Long Beach, turning it from a working-class port city into a place defined by constant conflict. For the Rolling 20s, Insanes, and Longos, every new generation stepped into a fight that had already taken countless lives. For the residents caught between, it meant living inside a city where survival was never guaranteed. The streets of Long Beach had become a battlefield, and the war was far from over. By 1989, Long Beach had already been bleeding for years, but the temperature rose even higher when the Tiny Rascals gang carried out a drive-by killing that shook the city. That attack left a Longo member dead, and it sparked an all-out retaliation campaign that pushed the war into another gear. The TRG and Longos locked horns in a way that made every street corner in Eastside Long Beach feel like a trap waiting to spring. For Cambodian kids, the decision to pick up guns was no longer just about survival. It had become about pride, and the Longos refused to let their dominance slip without striking back. In the early 1990s, the back and forth between Longos and Cambodian gangs produced dozens of drive-by shootings across Long Beach. Some of those shootings took place in daylight hours when families were outside, proving how reckless the situation had become. The police kept track of shootings almost nightly, with reports stacking up of wounded teenagers, slain gang members, and innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. The violence between TRG and Longos carried a racial undertone that could not be ignored because it was no longer just gang versus gang. For many on the streets, it felt like Latino versus Asian, and the fear inside schools and neighborhoods reflected that tension. As those wars played out, African-American gangs like the Rolling 20s and the Insanes found themselves drawn even deeper into the chaos. The Longos viewed every black gang as an enemy, so whether it was retaliation or preemptive attacks, the Crips were always in the mix. That meant the Rolling 20s were not only fighting their own feud with the Insanes, but were also keeping their eyes on Longo activity. It was a three-way conflict expanded into something larger, because now Cambodian gangs were fully in the fight, adding more blood to the city's already long list of casualties. By the early 1990s, Longbeach was seeing shootings nearly every week connected to this tangled web of rivalries. Families lived in fear of crossing through the wrong neighborhood, because one mistake could lead to being mistaken for the wrong set. The streets of Longbeach became one of the most dangerous places in California, and the nickname Crip City carried even heavier meaning. That period set the tone for the darkest years Longbeach ever saw. In 1993, Longbeach gang culture hit the national spotlight when Calvin Broadus, better known as Snoop Dogg, was charged in a murder case. The case centered on the killing of a rival gang member, Philip Weldemariam, who was shot by Snoop's bodyguard McKinley Lee outside an apartment in Los Angeles. Although the killing did not happen directly in Longbeach, Snoop's background as a Rolling 20s affiliate tied the case back to the city. The trial became a media circus, with national outlets portraying Longbeach as a hub of gang violence spilling into the music industry. For the Rolling 20s, the case meant their name was in headlines across America, and their reputation was tied forever to one of hip-hop's biggest stars. The trial ended with Snoop Dogg acquitted in 1996, but during those years, Longbeach carried a spotlight it did not want. News crews filmed in neighborhoods, showing graffiti-filled alleys and interviewing residents who spoke about living under constant fear. The image of Longbeach as Crip City became fixed in the minds of people who had never visited the city. The connection between gang culture and music only made their reputation stronger, because every time Snoop or another Longbeach rapper dropped a record, the streets got mentioned. While the media covered the trial, the streets were still on fire. In 1996, the Rolling 20s carried out a notorious shooting spree along Pacific Avenue as retaliation for previous killings. Reports describe cars driving down the busy street, spraying bullets into crowds and businesses, leaving multiple victims and drawing massive attention from law enforcement. That spree was one of the most infamous acts of violence linked to the Rolling 20s, showing how retaliation had escalated beyond targeted attacks into open assaults on public areas. For residents, the Pacific Avenue spree was proof that the war could touch anyone at any time, no matter if they were involved or not. Throughout the early 1990s, the body count continued to climb. Long Beach police records showed that in some years more than half the murders in the city were gang-related. Many of those killings connected directly back to the Rolling 20s, the Insanes, the Longos, or TRG, making those sets the names most feared in the streets. The court struggled to keep up with prosecutions, while jails filled with young men serving time for shootings that never ended the larger conflicts. Each arrest or conviction just made space for the next generation to step in, and the cycle continued without pause. The war spilled out of the streets and into schools, parks, and community centers. Teachers described classrooms where kids wore colors that linked them to gangs, and fights broke out daily over words or looks. Parks once meant for basketball games and family picnics became battlegrounds where rival sets clashed openly. Even community events were shadowed by the threat of violence, because rival members showing up in the same space often led to gunfire. For many families in Long Beach, raising kids in that environment meant teaching them survival skills as much as education. The media attention from the Snoop Dogg trial only fueled stereotypes that Long Beach was a lost city consumed by Crip culture. Journalists used terms like gangland and war zone, describing Long Beach in the same breath as Compton and South Central Los Angeles. For the people living there, those words were not exaggerations. Shootings in daylight, drive-by attacks on busy streets, and kids carrying guns to school made life in Long Beach feel like surviving in a combat zone. By the mid-1990s, Long Beach gangs had reached levels of notoriety that made them household names across the country. The Rolling 20s carried fame through Snoop Dogg's music. The Insanes carried a reputation as one of the largest black gangs in the city, and the Longos remained one of the most feared Latino gangs on the West Coast. TRG, once a small Cambodian crew, had grown into a nationwide network known for their ferocity. Together, these groups represented the peak of gang culture in Long Beach, with violence, music, and media attention all colliding at once. The years between 1989 and the mid-1990s left scars that never healed. Hundreds of lives were lost, neighborhoods were hollowed out by fear, and the city's identity changed forever. Long Beach was no longer seen as a beach community or a port town. It was seen as Crip City, a place where wars never stopped and blood stained the sidewalks. That era defined how the world viewed Long Beach, and its reputation from those years still echoes decades later. By the late 1990s, the city of Long Beach was still carrying the weight of years of war, and the headlines showed how deep the violence continued to run. Among the most shocking stories was the killing of Kenneth Kibo Wilson in 1999, a death that left another scar on the already battered community. Kibo had been a known figure tied to the streets, and his death came at the hands of insane Crips members. Reports described how the attack was not random, but carried out as part of the ongoing cycle of retaliation that had been eating at the city for decades. The loss of Kibo became one more name in the long list of lives lost to the rivalry, and it showed that the insane set still held power and aggression even after years of constant conflict. The late 1990s also saw courts processing cases from the earlier bloodshed, and one of the most infamous was the conviction of Kiongozi Jones from the Rolling 20s. Jones was tied to murders carried out in 1996, part of the violent spree that had marked those years as some of the deadliest in Long Beach history. His conviction became a symbol of how the justice system tried to hold figures accountable while the streets kept producing new cases of violence. For the Rolling 20s, his case showed how law enforcement was locking onto their members and sending them away for decades. But it did not stop the younger generation from stepping forward to fill the ranks. As the older members faced prison or death, new branches of gangs emerged to carry the torch. Among the insane Crips, the baby insanes began to rise in prominence during the 1990s and into the early 2000s. The baby insanes represented the next generation of soldiers, younger members who were willing to take extreme risks to keep the set's name feared in the city. They became known for their militancy, their willingness to use violence quickly, and their role in continuing the insane presence across Long Beach. Police files and community reports described how the baby insanes gave the larger insane Crip family a fresh wave of energy, keeping their name active in conflicts with both Rolling 20s and Longos. These developments were not just about gang names and turf. They tore apart real families living in the neighborhoods. It was not uncommon for households to be split between Rolling 20s and insanes, with brothers, cousins, or close friends finding themselves on opposite sides of the feud. Some families carried both affiliations under one roof, creating tension that often erupted in violence or forced people to cut off their own relatives. Stories circulated of family gatherings ruined by arguments about colors, blocks, or affiliations, showing how deeply the war had embedded itself into personal lives. The code of the streets demanded retaliation for every slight, every attack, and every killing, and that code guaranteed the cycle would never stop. If a Rolling 20s member got killed, his homies felt obligated to ride out and even the score. If an insane got shot, his set answered with gunfire as soon as possible. The Longos followed the same code, and the TRG lived by it too. This culture of retaliation became the engine of violence in Long Beach, making peace almost impossible because every act demanded another act in response. Law enforcement officials often described this cycle as self-sustaining, with each shooting leading to another in a loop that had no natural ending. Even when older members went to prison or were killed, younger members stepped in and carried on the same codes they had been taught. Respect and pride mattered more than safety, and letting an enemy get away with something without striking back was seen as weakness. That mindset guaranteed that the streets of Long Beach would keep bleeding, because no one wanted to be the first to step down. The case of Kibo's death highlighted how violent confrontations could erupt even after years of constant bloodshed. The conviction of Kiongozi Jones showed how the courts tried to break the cycle, but the effect was limited when younger generations refused to let old grudges die. The rise of the baby insanes proved that gangs were not fading, but regenerating, passing down codes and grudges like inheritance. Families torn apart by affiliations lived with daily reminders that the war was not just outside their doors, but sometimes inside their homes. By the end of the 1990s, Long Beach remained a city defined by these wars, with every notorious case and every new clique reinforcing the idea that the cycle had no end. The war had entered the courts, the media, and the households of the city, but it had never left the streets. The story of this era was not just about names like Rolling 20s, Insanes, or Longos. It was about the endless loop of retaliation that shaped how generations of kids grew up in Long Beach. By the mid-1990s, Long Beach law enforcement had grown tired of watching the streets bleed year after year. City leaders and police pushed for stronger measures, and civil injunctions became one of the main weapons used against the largest sets. These injunctions banned members from gathering in certain areas, wearing gang colors, or associating in public, and they were designed to weaken the street presence that had made gangs so dominant. In 1995, the first major injunction landed against the Westside Longos. targeting a group that had built its reputation through intimidation and constant clashes with African American gangs. The injunction made it illegal for identified members to be together in public, forcing them to break up their hangouts in parks, alleys, and front yards. For residents, this created temporary relief because corners once crowded with Longos suddenly grew quiet. For the gang, it meant a shift in how they operated, with more activity pushed behind closed doors rather than in plain sight. In 1997, the city hit the rolling 80s, another set tied into Longbeach conflicts, with their own injunction. This signaled that authorities were willing to expand the tactic across multiple groups, treating it as a blueprint for handling the gang crisis. By 2001, the Eastside Longos were placed under Injunction 2, a move that directly targeted one of the most feared Latino sets in the city. In 2010, the insane Crips were finally placed under the same kind of order, showing that after years of warfare, law enforcement was still chasing solutions to limit their influence. The impact of these injunctions was complicated. On one hand, they made it harder for gangs to post up openly in their territories, because police could arrest them simply for standing together in certain zones. On the other hand, the orders scattered members across different neighborhoods, breaking the tight structure that once kept them locked into familiar corners. Violence did not disappear. It spread, moving into areas where police had less focus. The power vacuums left behind by injunctions also encouraged younger cliques to rise, with smaller crews stepping up to fill the gaps left by older sets under pressure. Beyond the injunctions, law enforcement also leaned into federal strategies that brought heavier charges. Federal cases and RICO indictments targeted Longbeach sets with conspiracy and racketeering charges, aiming to dismantle the leadership structures. These cases pulled members into long prison sentences, but they also showed how deeply organized some of the sets had become. Task forces combined local police, federal agents, and community leaders to try and cut into drug trafficking, weapons sales, and the networks that funded gang activity. While these crackdowns put pressure on traditional gang activity, they also pushed some members toward different kinds of crime. The most famous example came in 2012 when the Baby Insanes were tied to a massive fraud case that shocked many people in the city. Federal investigators uncovered a scheme involving stolen identities, fraudulent credit cards, and bank scams that brought in millions of dollars. The case showed that the Baby Insanes had shifted from just street-level violence to more complex financial crimes, proving that pressure from injunctions and arrests could change tactics, but not eliminate activity. The fraud case became a symbol of how gangs in Long Beach were evolving. With heavy law enforcement focus on shootings and street presence, some members looked for ways to make money with less visibility. That did not mean violence disappeared, but it showed that the culture of hustling and survival adapted when police tactics changed. For many in Long Beach, the realization was sobering because it proved that even after decades of injunctions, arrests, and federal cases, the cycle had not truly ended. Community task forces tried to bring balance, with outreach programs, youth centers, and job training offered as alternatives to the gang life. Some programs made progress, helping kids step away before they got pulled into the cycle of retaliation. But for many families living in neighborhoods still scarred by decades of war, the lure of sets like the Rollin' 20s, the Insanes, or the Longos remained strong. The culture of respect, fear, and survival did not disappear overnight, even when law enforcement flooded the streets with new strategies. By the early 2010s, Long Beach was still dealing with the long shadow of its gang wars. Injunctions had changed the visible presence of sets, scattering their gatherings and making public corners safer for residents. But the deeper issues of poverty, identity, and retaliation meant that violence never fully vanished. Federal cases and RICO indictments proved that some gangs were running as criminal enterprises, while cases like the Baby Insane fraud bust showed just how far members were willing to pivot to keep hustling. The crackdown era revealed a truth that residents already understood. Long Beach gangs were not just groups of young men on corners. They were networks built into the fabric of the city. Law enforcement could scatter them, indict them, or send them to prison, but the culture and identity that fueled their existence carried on. The story of the crackdowns was not just about police and courts. It was about how a city tried to wrestle back control from decades of war and how the streets kept finding new ways to fight back. By the late 2000s, Long Beach had begun to change, shaped both by the relentless crackdowns from law enforcement and by the weariness of generations who had grown up in the cycle of war. The same neighborhoods that once echoed with gunfire started seeing more community programs, more police patrols, and more efforts to shift the culture away from endless retaliation. The violence never fully vanished, but the pace slowed as older members aged out, younger kids found different paths, and the city itself evolved. One major factor in the decline of open warfare was the effectiveness of injunctions and federal indictments, which scattered many of the most active sets. Leaders were taken off the streets, drug networks were disrupted, and the visibility that had once made Long Beach a feared place began to fade. By the 2010s, the streets no longer carried the same constant presence of rolling 20s or insanes hanging on corners in large groups. That absence did not mean peace, but it marked a shift in how the gangs operated, with more of the activity happening behind the scenes instead of in plain view. At the same time, cultural shifts were shaping how Long Beach was seen by the outside world. Music continued to play a role, with the legacy of Snoop Dogg, Warren G, and Nate Dogg keeping the Rollin' 20s name alive in hip-hop culture. The city's identity as Crip City remained a part of its reputation, but younger artists began using their platforms to tell more complex stories. Some leaned into the gritty history, while others highlighted resilience and survival beyond the gang wars. Long Beach's influence in music became one of the city's most lasting exports, giving it recognition far beyond its borders. For families inside the city, the scars of the wars were harder to shake. Generations had been lost to prisons, cemeteries, and streets that demanded loyalty at too high a cost. Many households carried memories of relatives killed in drive-by shootings or locked away for decades on gang charges. The wars had left an imprint not only on the streets, but on the family trees of countless Long Beach residents. That legacy could not be erased by a drop in homicides or by headlines that claimed gang violence was declining. The legacy also carried into schools, where teachers and students continued dealing with the weight of decades of conflict. While the height of the wars in the 1990s had passed, many young people still grew up in neighborhoods where sets held influence. Graffiti, hand signs, and stories of older brothers or cousins kept the culture alive, even if shootings were less frequent. For the next generation, the question was no longer whether the wars defined Long Beach, but how much of that history they wanted to carry forward. Community leaders and outreach workers played a big role in shaping what came next. Programs that offered job training, mentorship, and safe spaces for youth began to gain traction, giving kids alternatives to jumping into sets. Former gang members who had lived through the worst years often became the most powerful voices in these efforts, using their credibility to reach young people who might not listen to outsiders. These efforts did not erase the wars of the past, but they created cracks in the cycle of retaliation, showing that other paths were possible. Still, the reputation of Long Beach as a city marked by gangs continued to influence how outsiders viewed it. Even as homicide rates dropped, the nickname Crip City stayed attached, a reminder of how deeply the wars had burned themselves into the city's image. For residents, living with that name carried a mix of pride and pain. Pride in the resilience of surviving those years, and pain in the losses that came with it. The cultural impact was lasting, because Long Beach would always be known as a place where some of the bloodiest gang wars in California history took place. Looking back, the story of the Rollin' 20s, the Insanes, the Longos, and the TRG tells more than just a tale of violence. It is a story about how identity, pride, and survival shaped an entire city. It is about how alliances turned into rivalries, how neighborhoods became battlegrounds, and how families carried the weight of wars that lasted decades. It is about how music turned local streets into international stories, and how law enforcement fought to pull the city back from the brink. By the 2020s, Long Beach stood as a city still carrying that history, but also moving into new chapters. The bloodshed of the past remained in memory, graffiti, and family stories, but it no longer dominated the streets the way it once did. The legacy of those wars lives on in the names, the music, and the scars left behind, a reminder of what the city endured and what it overcame. The story of Long Beach's gang wars is not just history, it is identity, and it will always shape how the city is remembered.